The mountains of northern Colorado do not care about your faith or your family or the small, fragile life of a child. They are indifferent slabs of granite and ancient pine that have watched civilizations crumble into the dirt without blinking a single stony eye. In the Comanche Peak wilderness, the air is thin and tastes of cold iron and dead needles. It is a place where the silence is not peaceful but heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressed over your mouth. People go there to find themselves, but sometimes the wilderness finds them first. It is a predatory landscape that waits for the exact moment your attention wavers, for the split second you turn your head to check a strap or wipe sweat from your brow. On the 2nd of October 1999, the weather was deceptively kind for the high country. Jaryd Atadero had taken his 2 children to the Big Thompson Canyon for a weekend of hiking with a group of friends from a local Christian singles organization. There were 11 adults in total, a number that should have provided a fortress of safety for a 3-year-old boy. Jaryd Atadero was a vibrant child with a mop of curly hair and a laugh that could cut through the oppressive quiet of the woods. He was wearing a blue fleece jacket and sturdy little sneakers. He was a boy who loved to run and explore, and on that morning the trail seemed like a playground rather than a graveyard. The group began their ascent toward the meadows near the Big Thompson River around 10 o'clock in the morning. The trail was well defined and flanked by steep slopes and dense thickets of mountain mahogany and aspen. Jaryd was full of energy and kept darting ahead of the adults, as children often do when the world feels wide and inviting. He would run 20 feet ahead and then stop to wait for the slower grown-ups. There was a sense of communal security among the 11 hikers. They assumed that with so many eyes on the trail, a small child could never truly be out of sight for more than a heartbeat. But the mountain is a master of the heartbeat. Around 11:30 in the morning, the group encountered 2 fishermen coming down from the upper reaches of the canyon. The fishermen stopped to chat and mentioned that they had seen a small boy a little further up the trail. They asked if the boy belonged to them because he seemed to be on his own. This was the first cold finger of dread that stroked the back of Jaryd Atadero's neck. He looked up the trail and saw nothing but the flickering shadows of the aspen leaves. Jaryd was gone. He had vanished in the span of time it takes to draw a single deep breath of that thin mountain air. The initial search was frantic and disorganized as the hikers called out Jaryd's name into the vast echoing maw of the canyon. They expected him to giggle from behind a tree or pop out from a cluster of boulders. But the only response was the wind whistling through the jagged rocks and the distant rush of the river. By the time the Larimer County Sheriff's Department arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long, distorted shadows across the search area. The temperature began to plummet, dropping toward the freezing mark as the light failed. A 3-year-old boy in a light fleece jacket cannot survive long when the mountain decides to turn cold. What followed was one of the most intensive search and rescue operations in Colorado history. Over the next several days, hundreds of volunteers and professional searchers combed the rugged terrain. They brought in bloodhounds and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras that could detect the heat signature of a rabbit from 1,000 feet up. They looked in every crevice and under every fallen log. The dogs were the most unsettling part of the mystery. They would pick up a scent near the trail and then abruptly stop, as if the trail of the boy simply ascended into the sky. They whimpered and paced in circles, refusing to cross invisible lines in the dirt. The searchers reported a strange, oppressive feeling in certain pockets of the canyon. Some described a localized silence where the sound of the river and the birds simply ceased to exist. They felt watched by something that stayed just out of sight behind the veil of the trees. Despite the massive manpower and the cutting-edge technology, not a single shred of blue fleece was found. No footprint was pressed into the soft mud near the water. No broken branch indicated a struggle or a fall. Jaryd Atadero had been erased from the physical world as if he had never stepped foot on that mountain. The case went cold for nearly 4 years while Jaryd Atadero lived in a purgatory of grief and unanswered questions. He refused to believe his son had simply walked away and died of exposure. The geometry of the disappearance did not fit the logic of the terrain. Then in June of 2003, 2 hikers were moving through a steep, treacherous area nearly 500 feet above the trail where Jaryd was last seen. This was a slope so vertical and rugged that seasoned hikers struggled to navigate it. It was not a place a 3-year-old boy could reach on his own without a ladder or wings. There, among the jagged rocks, they found a small blue fleece jacket. Nearby were a pair of tiny sneakers and a single strand of hair caught in a piece of clothing. The discovery was not a relief, but a new descent into horror. The clothing was not scattered or torn as one would expect from a predatory attack. The pants were found turned completely inside out. The shoes were neatly placed and still had the laces tied, but there were no socks inside them, and no socks were ever found at the site. A fragment of a human skull was discovered nearby, showing signs of being bleached by the sun. I have looked at the photographs of those clothes, and they tell a story that defies the official narrative of a mountain lion attack. If a cougar takes a child, it drags the body to a secluded spot to feed. It leaves blood and gore, and the clothing is shredded by claws and teeth. But Jaryd's clothes were relatively intact. The inside-out nature of the pants suggests a deliberate removal. A 3-year-old does not stop in the middle of a steep climb to take off his shoes and peel his pants off inside out before continuing to his death. It feels more like a biological specimen being processed and then discarded. The location of the remains is the most damning piece of evidence against a natural explanation. To reach that high ridge, Jaryd would have had to climb through dense brush and over massive boulders that would have been impassable for his small frame. He would have had to travel a distance and an elevation gain that defies the physical capabilities of a toddler. And he would have had to do it all without leaving a single trace for the search dogs or the infrared cameras to find in the days immediately following his disappearance. The math of the mountain does not add up. Some investigators pointed to the mountain lion theory because it was the easiest way to close a file that kept them awake at night. They claimed a cat could have carried him up there. But lions do not undress their prey. They do not leave shoes neatly tied. And they certainly do not leave a single skull fragment while the rest of the skeleton vanishes into the ether. There is a clinical precision to the way Jaryd's remains were found that suggests something much more calculated and much more alien to our understanding of the natural world. The silence that took Jaryd Atadero is the same silence that has claimed hundreds of others in our national parks. It is a silence that bypasses our technology and our logic. It is as if there are thin spots in the world, places where the fabric of our reality is worn through, and things can slip in or out. When Jaryd turned that corner on the trail, he didn't just walk out of sight of his father. He walked out of our dimension and into a cold, predatory space that eventually spat back the pieces it didn't want to keep. We are left with the image of a small boy, standing on a ridge he could never have climbed, looking down at a world he would never return to. The mountain didn't just take his life, it took his story and replaced it with a series of impossible clues. We look at the inside-out pants and the tied shoes and we feel a primitive shiver, because we know deep down that the rules we live by do not apply in the high places. There are things in the woods that do not hunt for hunger, but for reasons we cannot begin to fathom. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident of geographical impossibility. In 1958, a young boy named Bobby Bizup disappeared from a church camp in Rocky Mountain National Park under nearly identical circumstances. He was seen one moment and gone the next, and despite a massive search, no trace was found until a year later. His remains were discovered on a high ridge that was deemed unreachable for a child of his age and physical condition. The pattern is there for those who are willing to look into the darkness and see the shape of the thing that is looking back. Stay off the high ridges when the silence starts to feel heavy. The air in the Big Thompson Canyon has a way of turning cold long before the sun actually dips behind the jagged teeth of the Mummy Range. It is a heavy, predatory sort of cold that settles in your marrow and whispers about things that lived here long before humans decided to draw lines on a map and call it a national park. I have spent years staring at these maps, tracing the contour lines with a trembling finger, trying to make the geometry of disappearance make sense. But the truth is that the wilderness does not care about your geometry or your physics. It operates on a set of laws that are written in the language of shadow and silence. When Jaryd Atadero vanished on that trail in October of 1999, he did not just step off the path. He stepped out of the version of reality where things have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The group was large, 11 people in total, hiking up toward the Comanche Peak wilderness. Jaryd was 3 years old, a bundle of energy in a blue pullover and small sneakers, running ahead of the adults, as children often do when they feel the intoxicating freedom of the high country. He was only a few feet ahead, just around a single bend in the trail where the granite walls press in close and the ponderosa pines stand like silent sentinels. His father Alan was right there, just seconds behind him. There was no scream. There was no sound of a struggle or the frantic scuffle of a predator moving through the underbrush. There was only the sudden, suffocating weight of the silence. A silence so absolute, it felt like the mountain had suddenly held its breath. When Alan rounded that corner, the world was empty. The trail stretched out ahead of him, a dusty ribbon of brown earth and pine needles, but the boy was gone. In the space of less than 30 seconds, a 3-year-old child had vanished into thin air. The immediate reaction is always the same. You call the name. You think they are hiding behind a rock or playing a game. But as the minutes bleed into hours, that irritation turns into a cold, sickening dread that pools in the pit of your stomach. The search that followed was one of the most intensive in Colorado history, involving bloodhounds, helicopters with infrared sensors, and hundreds of volunteers. They scoured every inch of that terrain. They looked under every fallen log and inside every crevice. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of blue fabric. Not a single scent for the dogs to follow. The dogs are the most telling part of these stories. These are animals trained to find a needle in a haystack to track a scent that is days old through rain and wind. But in the Atadero case, as in so many others, I have investigated, the dogs simply stopped. They would reach a certain point on the trail and then sit down whimpering or looking up into the air with a primal terror in their eyes. It is as if the scent trail did not lead away into the woods but simply ended. As if Jaryd had been plucked from the earth by a giant invisible hand. The infrared cameras, which can detect the heat signature of a small rabbit from thousands of feet in the air, saw only the cold, indifferent gray of the mountain. It was as if the boy had ceased to exist as a biological entity the moment he turned that corner. 4 years passed. 4 years of Alan Atadero living in a purgatory of unanswered questions and whispered rumors. Then, in 2003, 2 hikers were moving through a rugged area about 550 feet above the trail where Jaryd had vanished. This was not a place a 3-year-old could get to. To reach this spot, you have to scramble up nearly vertical rock faces and push through mountain mahogany and thorny brush that would tear the skin off a grown man. It is a climb that requires equipment and experience. And yet there they were. Jaryd's sneakers, his blue pullover, his pants, and a single fragment of a skull. When the investigators laid out the clothing, the air in the room went cold. The sneakers were sitting there side by side with the laces still neatly tied. Think about that for a moment. If a mountain lion had taken that boy, it would have used its claws and teeth to shred the fabric. There would have been blood spray, bone fragments, and a chaotic mess of viscera. But there was no blood. The clothing was not torn by teeth or claws. Even more unsettling was the fact that the pants and the pullover were found inside out. It is a detail that haunts the periphery of my vision every time I close my eyes. Something had undressed that boy with a clinical, terrifying precision and then turned his clothes inside out before discarding them on a ridge that he could never have reached on his own. The official report mentioned mountain lions because the human mind requires a monster it can understand. We can process a big cat. We can understand a predator that kills for meat. But a mountain lion does not carefully remove a child's shoes and leave the laces tied. It does not invert the clothing like it is performing some kind of strange ritualistic inventory. And it certainly does not carry a body up a vertical cliff face only to leave a single piece of the skull while the rest of the skeleton vanishes into the ether. There is a surgical quality to the scene that suggests something much more calculated. Something that views us not as prey but as specimens to be examined and then discarded when the curiosity has been satisfied. I have walked those trails. I have felt the way the light changes when you get above the 8,000-foot mark. There is a thinness to the air that goes beyond the lack of oxygen. It feels as though the veil between what we know and what we fear is stretched so tight it is translucent. Some people talk about portals or dimensional shifts, and while those words sound like science fiction, they are the only words we have to describe the impossible. If you have a child who disappears in 30 seconds and is found years later on an unreachable peak with his clothes inside out and no sign of a struggle, you are no longer dealing with the natural world. You are dealing with the architecture of the unknown. The silence that took Jaryd is a recurring character in these cases. I have interviewed dozens of people who have had near misses in the woods. They all describe the same thing. One moment the forest is alive with the sound of birds, the hum of insects, and the rustle of the wind. Then in an instant, it all stops. The sound is sucked out of the world as if someone flipped a switch. The air becomes heavy like it is saturated with static electricity. They feel a sense of intense, localized dread. A feeling of being watched by something that is not behind a tree, but is somehow part of the atmosphere itself. Those who survive are the ones who run, who don't look back, who listen to that primitive lizard brain screaming at them to get away from the quiet. Jaryd was too young to know that the silence is a predator. We like to think that our technology makes us safe. We have GPS satellite phones and drones. We think we have conquered the wild places because we have put them on a screen. But when you are out there and the silence hits, you realize that your gear is just a collection of plastic and glass that means nothing to the mountain. The mountain has been taking people for thousands of years. It took the indigenous people who warned of the mountain devils, and it takes the tourists who think they are in a theme park. The case of Jaryd Atadero is a grim reminder that there are places on this earth where we are not at the top of the food chain. And we might not even be on the menu. We might just be a curiosity to something that exists in the spaces between the atoms. When we look at the patterns, the hair on the back of your neck begins to stand up. It is not just the impossible terrain or the lack of scent. It is the specific items left behind. Why always the shoes? Why are they so often found neatly placed far from where they should be? In many of these cases, the victims are found near water or in areas of high granite concentration. There is a theory that these elements act as a sort of conductor, a way for whatever is out there to bridge the gap between their world and ours. Granite is high in quartz, a crystal that can hold and transmit energy. Water is a life force and a conductor. When you put a human being in the middle of that confluence, you might be creating the perfect conditions for a disappearance that defies every law of man. The investigators who worked the Atadero case are often reluctant to speak on the record about their true feelings. They give the company line about animal predation or exposure. But when the microphones are off and the lights are low, they admit that the math does not add up. They admit that they have seen things in the woods that they cannot explain. One searcher told me about finding a set of tracks that just stopped in the middle of a snowfield. No return tracks, no sign of a jump. Just a set of boots that ended as if the person had been hoisted directly into the sky. Another spoke of hearing a voice calling his name from a ravine, a voice that sounded exactly like his wife, even though she was 100 miles away. These are the things that don't make it into the official files. These are the things that keep the searchers awake at night. Think about the physical exertion required for a 3-year-old to climb 500 feet in elevation through a wilderness area. His little lungs would have been burning. His legs would have been screaming. He would have been crying for his father. And yet no one heard a sound. Not the hikers nearby, not the father who was only yards away. It is as if Jaryd was moved through a medium that does not conduct sound. A vacuum in the middle of the forest. By the time he reached that ridge, if he ever reached it while he was alive, he was in a place that no human eyes were meant to see. The fact that his clothing was found years later suggests that he was brought back, or at least his remains were. The mountain didn't just take him. It kept him, changed him, and then returned the pieces it had no use for. It is a cold comfort for a father to find a fragment of a skull and a pair of tied shoes. Jaryd Atadero has spent the last 2 decades trying to keep his son's memory alive, but he is also keeping the mystery alive. He knows that the mountain lion story is a lie, told to make the public feel safe. If we admit that a child can be taken by something we cannot see or track, then no one would ever visit a national park again. The economy of the wilderness depends on the illusion of safety. But the reality is written in the inside-out pants of a 3-year-old boy. The reality is that the woods are not just trees and dirt. They are a complex ancient system that occasionally reaches out and grabs a piece of our world for reasons we cannot begin to fathom. The more you look into these cases, the more you see the same shadow. You see the same impossible distances. You see the same lack of tracks. You see the same strange state of the clothing. It is a signature. It is the calling card of a predator that does not hunt for hunger. It hunts for something else. Perhaps it is a form of energy. Perhaps it is a form of information. Or perhaps it is simply because it can. We are like ants crawling across a circuit board, unaware of the currents flowing beneath our feet until a spark jumps and one of us is incinerated. We call it a tragedy. The mountain calls it Tuesday. The case of Jaryd Atadero is mirrored with haunting accuracy by the disappearance of Bobby Bizup in 1958. Bobby was 10 years old, staying at a church camp in Rocky Mountain National Park. He was a bright boy, but he was also visually impaired, wearing thick glasses that he needed to navigate even simple terrain. On a clear afternoon in August, Bobby was walking from the camp's dining hall to his cabin, a distance of only a few hundred feet. He was seen by multiple people. He was there, walking along a familiar path, and then he was gone. The search was massive, involving the Air Force, the National Guard, and hundreds of volunteers. They found nothing. No glasses, no clothing, no tracks. Just like Jaryd, Bobby's remains were not found until a year later. They were discovered on a high, rocky ridge called Mount Mika at an elevation of nearly 11,000 feet. To get there, Bobby would have had to hike miles away from the camp and climb thousands of vertical feet over some of the most treacherous terrain in the park. He would have had to do this without his glasses in the dark, and through a territory that even experienced mountaineers find challenging. When they found him, his clothing was scattered in a way that defied logic. His hearing aid was found on a rock perfectly intact. His remains were skeletal, but like Jaryd, there was a missing piece to the puzzle. The official cause of death was exposure, but everyone who knew the terrain knew that Bobby Bizup could not have made that climb. The similarities between Jaryd Atadero and Bobby Bizup are not coincidences. They are data points in a pattern of predatory behavior that spans decades and continents. Both boys vanished in a heartbeat. Both were found at high elevations that they could not have reached. Both left behind clothing that raised more questions than it answered. And both cases occurred in areas where the silence is known to descend like a shroud. When you look at these two stories side by side, you realize that we are not looking at two separate accidents. We are looking at the same entity, the same force, operating with the same methodology. It is a cold, calculated process that has been repeated hundreds of times in our wild places. The wilderness is a beautiful lie. We go there to find ourselves, to escape the noise of the city, to breathe the clean air. But we forget that the woods were here long before us, and they will be here long after we are gone. They are not our friends. They are a vast, indifferent machine that occasionally catches a human life in its gears. When you are out there on the trail and you feel that sudden drop in temperature, or you realize that the birds have stopped singing, do not stop to take a picture. Do not look for your child behind a rock. Grab them, hold them close, and get back to the world of concrete and steel as fast as you can. Because in the high places, the rules of our world are just suggestions, and the silence is always hungry. There is a final chilling thought that stays with me when I think about Jaryd and Bobby. It is the idea that they were not taken away, but that they were taken times elsewhere. If the world is full of thin spots, then perhaps the ridges where they were found are not just geographical high points, but places where the two worlds overlap. Maybe Jaryd didn't climb that mountain. Maybe he was just standing on a trail when the world shifted. And he found himself on a ridge in a different version of Colorado, one where the sun is cold and the silence is a physical weight. And maybe after 4 years that other world simply spat him back out, leaving his clothes inside out, as a final mocking gesture to those of us left behind to wonder. Stay off the high ridges when the silence starts to feel heavy.